I want you to picture a box. It's about 10 feet long, maybe 6 feet wide.
So yeah, tiny, like a walk-in closet, basically, or a decent-sized rug.
Right, exactly. Now, take away the light, all of it.
Okay.
I mean, maybe there's a crack high up in the wall, maybe 2 inches wide, that lets in a kind of gray haze for 20 minutes a day, but otherwise it is pitch black.
So you can't see your own hand in front of your face.
Not at all. And this is a stone fortress in Spain, so you know it's freezing cold in the winter.
Bone chilling, yeah.
And then stiflingly hot in the summer. The air is completely stagnant. It smells of, well, unwashed bodies and sickness.
You're in there alone.
You are in there alone. You are starving. And I mean literally skeletal, covered in lice. You haven't had a change of clothes in months.
Wow.
And every so often, the door opens. Not to let you out, but so you can be dragged into a cafeteria to be whipped in front of the very people you used to call your brothers.
It sounds like a description of a gulag. Or, I don't know, a black site prison.
It does. It is a machine designed to break a human being, to strip away sanity. But here is the paradox we're going to be wrestling with today.
Okay.
Out of that closet, out of that lice-ridden, freezing, hopeless box, came some of the most luminous, romantic, soaring poetry in the entire Spanish language.
Which is just almost impossible to reconcile, isn't it? You'd expect a manifesto of rage. You'd expect a screed against his captors.
Exactly. That's what I would write. But instead, we get flowers, we get wine cellars, we get the living flame of love. We get this intense, almost erotic description of union with the divine.
And we are talking, of course, about Juan Álvarez.
Better known to the world as St. John of the Cross.
A man who is technically a doctor of the church, which, you know, it sounds very stuffy and academic.
Very, very formal.
But his actual life was a thriller. I mean, you've got kidnappings, you've got a prison break that honestly rivals the Shawshank Redemption.
It really does. And then you have his body and, well, the afterlife of his physical remains is basically a horror movie in itself.
It gets incredibly macabre at the end, yeah.
So here's our mission for this deep dive. We have a stack of sources, Wikipedia excerpts covering his biography, his literary works, his intellectual influences, and the pretty complicated history of the Carmelite order.
Right.
We want to understand how this specific pressure cooker of suffering catalyzed a very unique type of wisdom. We want to decode the dark night of the soul, a phrase everyone uses, but almost nobody actually understands what he meant by it.
And to do that, I think we have to ignore the statues. You know, you see St. John of the Cross in churches, and he's this marble figure looking piously up at heaven.
Yeah.
We need to smash the marble. We need to find the starving boy from Fontiveros.
Let's start right there. 1542, Fontiveros, Spain.
Okay.
This is the Siglo de Oro, the Golden Age.
Right.
Spain is the superpower of the world. Gold is flowing in from the Americas. It should be a pretty good time to be Spanish.
It should be, yeah, if you're the right kind of Spanish. But Juan, he's born on the wrong side of every single track you can imagine.
Set the scene for his family dynamic. Because reading the notes, it honestly sounds like a soap opera right from the very start.
It really is. I mean, his father, Gonzalo, he actually came from money. He was from a family of wealthy silk merchants in Toledo.
So comfortable.
Very comfortable.
Yep.
Upper middle class, respectable. But Gonzalo commits the cardinal sin of 16th century social climbing. He falls in love.
With the wrong woman, I take it.
With the absolute wrong woman. Her name is Catalina. She's a weaver. She's poor. And crucially, she's an orphan. In a society that is completely obsessed with lineage and connections, she's a nobody. So when Gonzalo marries her, his family just goes nuclear. They disown him. They cut him off without a penny.
That seems extreme even for the time. Was it just pure classism? Or was there something else going on there?
It was likely a mix of that intense classism and just the sheer rigidity of the social structure. You did not marry down. It wasn't done. So Gonzalo goes from handling fine silk to weaving coarse cloth himself just to put bread on the table.
That is a massive fall from grace.
Huge. And it has lethal consequences for his family.
It does. Juan is born in 1542. His father dies in 1545.
So Juan is only 3. And now you have a widow, Catalina, with 3 little boys in a country with absolutely no social safety net whatsoever.
They aren't just poor in the modern sense, they're destitute.
Utterly destitute. And the notes mentioned his brother, Luis.
Yes.
Juan's older brother, Luis, dies just 2 years after the father. And the historical consensus is really blunt about it.
Yeah.
He died of malnutrition. He starved to death.
That is the context I think we miss when we read the theology later on. The man who wrote about the banquet of God literally watched his own brother die of hunger.
Precisely. It traumatizes the family, as you can imagine. Catalina is desperate. She starts moving them around First to Arevalo, then to Medina del Campo, just chasing any kind of work. She's just trying to keep her remaining two sons, Juan and Francisco, alive.
Now, there is another layer to this precarity that I really want to drill into. The sources all mention his converso heritage. For anyone who doesn't know 16th century Spanish history, can you unpack that label?
Yeah, this is absolutely crucial. Converso refers to families with Jewish roots who had converted to Catholicism, often, under the threat of expulsion or death back in 1492. So Juan was from what they called a new Christian family.
As opposed to an old Christian.
Correct. And that distinction was everything back then. Spain was obsessed with something called limpieza de sangre, purity of blood.
Right.
If you were a new Christian, you were suspect. Always. You couldn't hold certain government jobs. You were watched more closely by the Inquisition. There was this constant low-level hum of anxiety that you could be denounced at any moment for anything.
So John is growing up with a double target on his back. He's dirt poor, and he's racially suspect in the eyes of the state.
He is an outsider in every possible sense.
Yeah.
He doesn't belong to the rich, and he doesn't fully belong to the pure Spanish elite. And I think that outsider status is absolutely key to his psychology. He learns to be quiet. He learns to observe.
He eventually catches a break, though. He gets into a school in Medina del Campo.
He does. A charitable school. It was called the School of Doctrine. It was specifically for orphans and the desperately poor children of the town.
And there was a deal. Right. It wasn't just free education.
No, the deal was, we feed you, we clothe you, we teach you to read and write the catechism, and in exchange, you work.
What was his job?
He was an acolyte, an altar boy, at a nearby convent of Augustinian nuns. But he also worked at a hospital. And this is important. This wasn't a modern hospital. This was a place for people with syphilis, for the dying, for the contagious, the dregs of society.
So as a teenager, he's washing the sores of the dying.
He is intimate with suffering. He's intimate with the fragility of the human body from a very young age. But at the same time, his mind is just exploding. He turns out to be intellectually brilliant, and the Jesuits spot him.
And the Jesuits at this point are sort of the Navy SEALs of the church's intellectuals, right?
They absolutely are. They are the intellectual shock troops. The Society of Jesus is brand new, founded by Ignatius of Loyola. They are rigorous, aggressive, modern, and Juan studies humanities with them from 1559 to 1563.
So he's getting a world-class education.
Top of the line. Latin, Greek, rhetoric, all while still living in abject poverty.
So he's 21 years old. He's smart. He's educated. He could have been a brilliant Jesuit, but he takes a left turn. He joins the Carmelites. Why?
That is the million-dollar question. The sources aren't definitive on it. Maybe he wanted a life that was more contemplative than the Jesuits, who were very active out in the world.
Right, more academic.
Maybe. Or maybe he just liked the specific devotion to Mary that the Carmelites had. But for whatever reason, he joins them, takes the name John of St. Matthias, and then goes to the University of Salamanca.
Salamanca is the Harvard of its day.
It's the intellectual center of Europe. And he's not just sitting in the back row. He's interacting with absolute giants. The sources mention Fray Luis de Leon.
Who was?
A massive figure. Yeah. A brilliant biblical scholar, an expert in Hebrew and Aramaic. The fact that John is in this orbit means he's being exposed to the absolute cutting edge of biblical interpretation. He's learning how to read the Song of Songs, how to read the prophets in a very deep way.
So on paper, he's finally made it. He's a priest. He's ordained in 1567. He's a scholar. He has a career track ahead of him. But he's miserable.
He is deeply, deeply unsatisfied. You have to understand, the Carmelite order he joined had drifted.
Drifted how?
They had become comfortable. Over the centuries, the original very harsh rules had been relaxed. They were allowed to eat meat. They could own property. They wore comfortable shoes. They could socialize. It was a pretty pleasant life for a bachelor scholar.
But John didn't want a pleasant life.
Not at all. He wanted God. And he felt that all this comfort was just a distraction. He was actually planning to quit the Carmelites entirely and join the Carthusians.
And the Carthusians are the really intense ones, right? The ones who take a vow of silence and basically live in cells until they die.
Total silence, total solitude. They were the special forces of asceticism. John was packing his bags. He was ready to disappear into silence for the rest of his life.
And then, the plot twist. He meets a woman.
He meets the woman.
Yeah.
Teresa of Ávila.
I love the contrast here. You have John, who by all accounts was physically small, short, quiet, intense, very introverted. And then you have Teresa, who is this absolute force of nature.
She really is. She's charismatic. She's a leader. She's like a CEO in a habit.
Yeah.
She's 52. He's only 25. She comes to Medina del Campo to found a new convent, and she hears about this brilliant young friar who is about to leave the order. So she arranges a meeting.
What's the pitch? I mean, how do you convince a guy who wants to join a completely silent order to stay in the messy one he's trying to leave?
She essentially says to him, "Don't run away from the fight, help me fix it." She tells him she has this vision. She wants to bring the Carmelites back to their roots, back to the primitive rule from 1209.
Make Carmel great again, basically.
In a way, yeah. But for her, great meant hard. She wanted to strip away all the comfort. No meat. Fasting from the Feast of the Cross in September all the way to Easter.
Wow.
Total silence for long periods. Coarser habits. And the symbol of it all, the shoes.
This is the part that I think always confuses modern people. Why the obsession with footwear?
It's symbolic. It's about being grounded,
Yeah.
literally. It's about poverty. The mitigated, or calced, friars wore calzas, that's shoes and stockings.
Okay.
Teresa wanted them to go discalced, which means barefoot, or wearing only simple hemp sandals. So a visual marker that said, we are rejecting the softness of the world.
It's counterculture. It's almost punk rock for the 1500s.
It is. It's a statement. It's saying, you guys in your soft leather shoes have sold out. We are the real deal.
And John buys it.
He buys it completely. Hook, line, and sinker. He agrees to become the very first friar of this new reform. So in 1568, he goes to a place called Toledo. And monastery is a very generous word for it.
What about it?
It was a shack, a derelict farmhouse that someone had donated. It was falling apart.
But he's happy.
He is ecstatic. He's finally found the rigor he was looking for. He sweeps the floor. He builds a tiny chapel. And on November 28, 1568, he changes his name. No more John of St. Matthias. He becomes John of the Cross.
That name, it's so heavy. It feels like foreshadowing.
It's a declaration of intent. And the cross was coming for him much sooner than he thought. Because you can't just start a revolution within the church without making a lot of very powerful enemies.
Let's talk about those enemies, because usually when we hear about saints, we think everyone must have loved them, but John was hated.
Hated. You have to look at the politics of it. You have the Discalced Carmelites, the traditional ones, and the Discalced, the barefoot reformers.
Right.
The Calced friars looked at these barefoot upstarts and they felt judged. They felt threatened. Their way of life was being called into question.
You think you're holier than us.
Exactly. And as the reform started to grow, and it did grow, a lot of people were attracted to that intensity. The old guard decided they had to stamp it out. It turns into a kind of Carmelite civil war.
And like any civil war, it's full of confusing jurisdictions and shifting alliances.
It's an absolute mess. There are papal nuncios, that's the Pope's ambassadors involved. The King of Spain is involved. There are different overseers for different regions. But the real turning point is in 1576. The Carmelite leadership meets in Piacenza, Italy, and they decide to drop the hammer.
What do?
They issue an order for the total suppression of the Discalced houses.
So basically, shut it all down, go home, put your shoes back on.
Pretty much, yeah. But John and Teresa, they kind of ignore it. They have backing from the papal nuncio in Spain, a man named Ormaneto, so they think they're safe. Keep on working. John is in Ávila, serving as a confessor and spiritual director for the nuns at the Convent of the Incarnation.
But then their protector dies.
Yes. The nuncio, Ormaneto, dies in June of 1577. The shield is gone, and the wolves come out.
So December 2, 1577, take us there.
It's night. John is staying in a small cottage near the convent in Ávila. Suddenly, the door is smashed in. It's a group of Discalced Carmelites, his own order, but the opposing faction. And they brought some men-at-arms with them.
So this is a straight-up kidnapping.
It's an extraordinary rendition is what it is. They grab him. He tries to argue. He says, I answer to the Pope's new representative. But they don't care. They ignore his claims. They bundle him up, and they take him to Toledo.
And Toledo is the headquarters of the enemy.
It is the heart of darkness for him, the main Carmelite monastery in the region. He is brought before a tribunal of his fellow friars. They demand that he renounce the reform.
And he refuses.
He refuses. So they classify him as a rebel and an apostate.
Yeah.
And rebels need to be broken.
And this brings us right back to that box we started with.
The cell. It was barely large enough to lie down in. It might have been a former closet or even a privy. No window. Just that tiny little slit high up in the wall. He had the clothes on his back, and that was it. For 8 months.
Talk to me about the circular discipline. What was that?
It's just brutal. Once a week, sometimes more, the friars would all gather in the refectory, the dining hall, to eat. They would drag John out of his cell. They would strip him to the waist. And then, while the entire community watched, they would whip him.
This is psychological torture. These are men he knows, men he probably prayed with at some point.
Of course. And they would taunt him while they did it. They'd tell him the reform was dead, that Teresa had abandoned the cause, that nobody knew where he was and nobody was coming for him. They were trying to make him feel utterly abandoned by both God and man.
And what about his physical condition?
He was rotting. The lights were so bad he couldn't sleep. The cold in Toledo in winter is a biting, damp cold. He got frostbite on his toes.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the summer, the heat in that unventilated stone box was suffocating. He was suffering from dysentery. He was, for all intents and purposes, dying.
And this is the moment. If you or I were in that box, we'd be thinking about survival, maybe revenge, or we'd just go insane.
Most people would break. There's no question.
Yeah.
But John goes somewhere else entirely. And this is where we have to talk about how he composed his poetry, because he didn't have paper. He didn't have ink, at least not for the first several months.
So where does the poetry come from?
His mind. He composed verse after verse of his most famous poem, the Spiritual Canticle, entirely in his head. He memorized them. He recited them to himself in the dark to keep his sanity.
That is an unbelievable level of discipline. To build a cathedral of words in your head while your body is literally falling apart.
And the content of those words, let's just stop and unpack the irony here for a second.
Yeah.
He is in a place of hatred, of stench, of total confinement.
Right.
But he is writing about the mountains, the lonely wooded valleys, the rushing rivers, the whistling of love-stirring breezes. It's all about freedom and nature and beauty.
He's mentally escaping his physical prison.
I think it's more than escapism. He is actively asserting that the reality of God's love is more real than the reality of the prison walls. He is finding a vast, expansive freedom inside his own soul that his captors couldn't touch.
Eventually he does get paper, right? The sources mention that.
Yeah. Yes. After several months, a new jailer took over, a younger friar, who was apparently a bit more sympathetic. He saw the state John was in and took pity on him. He managed to smuggle in some paper and a quill and some ink, and John was finally able to write down all the verses he had been carrying in his head for months.
But paper or no paper, 8 months is a long time to rot. John has to realize he's going to die if he stays there.
He does. He knows they have no intention of ever releasing him. So the mystic becomes the action hero. He starts planning an escape.
This is the great escape section. I'm fascinated by this. How does a starving, physically weakened man break out of a monastery fortress?
Well, he was observant. He was a great observer of his surroundings. He noticed that during the day when the cell door was open for a moment for him to receive his meager food, the door itself hung on hinges that were, well, they were a bit loose.
Loose how?
They weren't modern hinges. They were basically large pins. He realized that if he could somehow loosen the screws or the pins while the guards weren't looking, he could just lift the whole door off its frame later on. So on August 15th, 1578, which is the Feast of the Assumption, a big holiday, he spent the day secretly working on those hinges.
Talk about nerves of steel. I mean, if he gets caught tampering with the door, the beatings would probably kill him in his state.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a huge risk. But he waits. Night falls. The monastery goes quiet. He gives the door a push. It gives. He lifts it off the hinges. He steps out into the corridor. But now he has a much bigger problem.
He's on the second floor of a fortress that's built on a cliff overlooking a river?
Exactly. He has to creep through the silent monastery. He gets to a gallery that overlooks a courtyard. Now, the courtyard isn't the street. It belonged to the convent of nuns next door. But it's his only way out.
And he obviously didn't bring a ladder with him.
No, but he brought his blankets and his tunic. He tore them into strips and tied them all together to make a makeshift rope.
Wow.
He tied one end to a lamp hook on the gallery wall and started to lower himself out the window.
I'm just picturing this frail, skeletal figure dangling against a stone wall in the dead of night.
And of course, the rope was too short.
It's never easy, is it?
Never. He had to drop the last few feet. He landed in the courtyard of the Conceptionist nuns. But he was still walled in. He had to scramble over piles of rubble and climb more walls to finally get out into the city streets of Toledo.
So he's out, but he's wearing a tattered Carmelite habit. He looks like a convict. It's the middle of the night. Where does he even go?
He goes to the only safe house he can think of, the monastery of Teresa's Discalced nuns in Toledo. Imagine the scene. It's almost dawn. The nuns are getting ready for their first prayers, and there's this desperate, weak knocking at the door.
It's me, John. I'm alive.
They open the door and they see a ghost. He was so weak he could barely stand. They immediately took him in, they hit him, and they began to nurse him back to health.
This is the point where I would expect him to retire. Okay, God, I did my bit for the cause. I'm going to a nice farm now.
You would think. But that is not John of the Cross. He spent just 6 weeks recovering, mostly at the hospital of Santa Cruz, and then right back to work.
Immediately. No tie off.
Immediately. In October of 1578, just 2 months after his escape, he travels to Almodóvar del Campo for a meeting of the reform's leaders. He's not quitting, he's doubling down.
And that meeting was pivotal, wasn't it?
It was. They realized that coexistence with the Discalced Carmelites was simply impossible. The kidnapping and imprisonment of John proved it beyond a doubt. So they decided to petition the Pope for a formal separation. They wanted to be their own independent order.
And John, having just escaped their dungeon, was living, breathing proof of why they needed that separation.
He was Exhibit A. And eventually, after a lot of politics, they got it. In 1580, Pope Gregory III signed the decree. The Discalced Carmelites were officially their own order. They were free.
Okay, let's pivot. We've covered the action movie part of his life. Now we need to cover the mind, because this is why he's a deep dive subject. It's the writing.
The writing is extraordinary. And here's a fun fact for you. In terms of sheer volume, he didn't write that much poetry. If you count up all the verses, it's less than 2,500 lines total.
That's like, what, a few chapbooks? Not a lot.
Very little. But the density, it's diamond hard. And the way he structured his work is really unique. He would write a poem, and then he would write a massive theological book explaining that same poem line by line, sometimes word by word.
So The Dark Night of the Soul is actually a book commenting on a poem called The Dark Night.
Precisely. It's like a director's commentary track for his own mystical experience. But the director is a genius.
Let's start with the spiritual canticle. You mentioned earlier it has this almost erotic imagery, the bride and the bridegroom.
Yes. It's structured as an eclogue, which is a kind of dialogue, and it's heavily, heavily influenced by the Song of Songs in the Bible. The soul is the bride, Jesus is the bridegroom, and the language is incredibly physical, very sensual.
How so?
I mean, there are references to breasts, to wine, to pomegranates, to entering the inner cellar.
Which feels a little spicy for a celibate monk.
It does to our modern ears, for sure. But in the mystical tradition, the intensity of romantic or sexual union is the closest human analogy they have for the intensity of spiritual union. It's all about desire. John is saying, you know that feeling of being desperately in love, of checking your phone every 2 seconds, of feeling sick when they aren't there? That is a shadow of how the soul feels about God.
So he's using the language of human romance to describe a spiritual reality because regular language just fails.
Exactly. He is pushing language to its absolute breaking point to try and describe the indescribable.
Now let's get to the big one. Dark Night of the Soul. We need to clear this up because I feel like I see this phrase used on Twitter or Instagram to mean, I'm having a bad week.
Yes, my Wi-Fi is down. I'm having a dark night of the soul.
Or people use it as a synonym for depression. But John isn't talking about clinical depression, is he?
No, and this is a really critical distinction to make. Depression is a malady. It's a state of stagnation or a kind of crushing heaviness. The dark night, for John, is a journey. It is a purposeful movement.
A movement from where to where?
From the self to God. And he breaks it down into 2 main phases. First, there's the night of sense.
Okay, night of sense. Unpack that for us.
So imagine you're learning to ride a bike. At first, you have training wheels. Your parents are holding the handlebars. You feel safe. You're having fun. That's the early spiritual life for many people. You get good feelings. You feel comforted by prayer. You enjoy the music at church.
Spiritual sugar, the treats?
Exactly, the spiritual treats. But to really learn how to ride, the training wheels have to come off. The night of sense is when God takes away the sugar. You pray and you feel nothing. You go to church and you're just bored. You lose all the sensory satisfaction you used to get from religion.
And most people would interpret that as, I'm doing something wrong or God has abandoned me.
Precisely. They panic. But John says, no, this is good. This is a necessary step. You are being weaned off spiritual milk and onto solid food. You are learning to love God for who he is, not for the good vibes he gives you.
So the darkness is actually a sign of progress, not failure.
Yes. It's the darkness of the womb before birth, or the darkness of a seed underground before it sprouts. It feels like death, but it's actually a prelude to a new kind of life.
Then there is the second phase, the night of the spirit.
This is the heavyweight division. This is for the soul that's much further along the path. This is a profound, deep purification where not just the senses, but the intellect, the will, and the memory are stripped bare. It is a total detachment from everything that isn't God. It's terrifying. It feels like annihilation.
But the destination makes it worth it.
The destination is union. That's the sunrise after the long night. And John insists that the light and love you find at the end is worth every single second of the darkness.
It's just so interesting that he wrote about this after being in a literal dark cell. Do you think he was mapping his prison experience onto his theology?
I don't think it's possible to separate them. He learned in that cell in Toledo that when you take away light, food, comfort, and human friendship, when you strip the senses down to nothing, you find God in the silence that's left. He turned his personal trauma into a universal map for others.
Let's touch on his other works just briefly. What about Ascent of Mount Carmel?
That's the companion piece to The Dark Knight. It's the how-to manual, in a way. It's very systematic. It explains the active part of the journey, what you can do to detach yourself from things, whereas The Dark Knight is more about the passive side, what God does to you in the darkness.
And the living flame of love.
That's the end game. He supposedly wrote the first draft in just 2 weeks. It describes the state of the soul that has passed through the night and is now burning with the love of God. It's not a painful fire anymore. It's a fire that illuminates, heals, and unites. It's ecstatic.
We should also mention he wasn't just a writer. He drew a little.
One specific drawing, yeah. It's a very small, simple sketch of the crucifixion. But the angle is what's so bizarre. It's not looking up at Jesus from the ground, like every other crucifixion painting. It's looking down on the cross from above.
The God's eye view.
Exactly. It's a shocking perspective. And that little sketch traveled through history. In the 20th century, the surrealist painter Salvador Dali saw it in a convent.
The famous surrealist.
The one and only. And Dali was completely blown away by the perspective. He used it as the direct model for his own famous 1951 painting, Christ of St. John of the Cross.
Oh, wow, I know that painting, where Christ is floating over the landscape, seen from above, with no nails and no blood.
That's the one. That iconic image comes directly from John's little pen and ink sketch. It's this amazing connection between a 16th century mystic and 20th century modern art. It just shows how timeless his vision was.
Speaking of his vision, there is a big debate about where John got his ideas. We know he read the Bible, we know he read the Church Fathers, but some scholars think there's another secret ingredient in the mix.
The Islamic theory. This is fascinating stuff. Scholars like Miguel Asian Palacios and later Lucy Lopez Baralt have argued that a lot of John's imagery is incredibly similar to Sufism, that is, Islamic mysticism.
Which isn't a crazy idea considering the history of Spain.
Not at all. Spain had been Al-Andalus, a center of Islamic culture for centuries. The culture was deep in the soil. The theory points to metaphors John uses, like the solitary bird, the lamps of fire, and this whole concept of mystical intoxication, or being drunk on God's love. These are all standard Sufi tropes.
I am drunk on the wine of love. That sounds like Rumi or Hafiz.
It does, and the idea of the Dark Knight itself has parallels in the Sufi concept of quid spiritual contraction or darkness embassed, which is spiritual expansion and light.
But John probably wasn't sitting in his cell reading the Quran.
Highly unlikely. But the argument is that these symbols were in the air. They were part of the cultural and linguistic vocabulary of Andalusia, left over from centuries of Islamic presence.
Is there a counter-argument to this theory?
Oh yes, very much so. Other scholars, like Peter Tyler, argue that you don't need to go to Mecca to explain John the Cross. You can go to the Rhineland.
The German mystics.
Exactly. The medieval German mystics, like Meister Eckhart or Johannes Tauler, also use the language of darkness, nothingness, and negation. So they argue John is firmly in a pre-existing Christian tradition.
And there's also the idea that he was just remixing pop culture, right?
The old Divino style, yeah.
Yeah.
This theory, from Damaso Alonso, suggests that John would take popular, secular love songs, the romanceros that people sang in the streets, and he would just rewrite the lyrics to be about God.
So he was taking the top 40 hits of 1570 and turning them into hymns.
Basically, yeah. He knew that the devil shouldn't have all the best tunes. He co-opted the passion and melody of human romance to hook people into thinking about divine romance.
Okay, so let's head toward the end of his life. The reform's established, the great books are written. You'd really hope for a peaceful retirement for the guy.
You would hope. But John was just a magnet for trouble. He held a series of high positions in the new order rector of colleges, vicar provincial of Andalusia. But in 1590, the political winds changed again.
Who was the problem this time? Not the Discalced Carmelites again?
No, this time the problem came from within the reform itself. The Discalced Carmelites started fighting internally. A man named Father Nicholas Doria became the vicar general.
And what was Doria's vibe?
He was a centralizer, an authoritarian. He wanted total control. He wanted to change the government of the order to be more monarchical, and he wanted to limit the freedom of the nuns. John disagreed. He stood up for the original, more democratic spirit of Teresa's vision.
And Doria didn't like that one bit.
Not at all. Doria began a smear campaign against John. He stripped him of all his offices. In 1591, the great founder of the reform was effectively exiled. He was sent to a lonely, isolated monastery in Andalusia called La Penuela.
Talk about gratitude. Thanks for the prison break. Thanks for the theology. Now get out.
It gets worse. There was serious talk of expelling him from the order entirely. He was treated as a pariah and a failure.
But then his body finally gave out.
He developed a case of erysipelas in his leg.
I looked this up. It's nasty.
It's a severe bacterial infection of the skin.
Hmm.
In a world without antibiotics, it just spreads. It causes massive inflammation, high fevers, and eventually necrosis of the tissue. It is excruciatingly painful.
He was moved to the town of Ubeda for treatment.
Yes, and the local prior there didn't like him either. He gave him the worst room in the monastery and openly complained about the cost of his medicine. So John is literally dying in agony, being treated like a burden by his own brothers. Again.
It's just a dark night right to the very end of his life.
It is. He died on December 14th, 1591. He was only 49 years old.
And as soon as he takes his last breath, the story shifts from just tragedy to, well, just plain weird.
Fanaticism is the only word for it. The moment the townspeople of Ubeda heard that the saint had died, they rushed the monastery. They didn't just want to pray, they wanted relics.
And when you say they wanted relics, what does that mean?
It means they started tearing his clothes off his body.
Yeah.
Snipping off pieces of his habit. They were trying to pull hair from his head. They were trying to take pieces of him.
That is horrifying.
It was a mob frenzy fueled by a very strange kind of devotion. Anyway, they buried him there in Ubeda. But remember, he was a superstar saint by this point. The monastery in Segovia, where he had served as prior, felt that they had a stronger claim on his body.
He belongs to us.
Exactly. So in 1593, 2 years after his death, permission was given to secretly exhume the body and move it to Segovia.
Secretly. A body snatching.
Under the cover of night, yeah. They dug him up, and according to the reports from the time, the body was incorrupt. It hadn't decayed at all. It supposedly smelled sweet like flowers.
Okay, so they load the saintly body onto a cart.
And they sneak it out of town.
Yeah.
But when the people of Ubeda woke up and found out, they went ballistic. They had been robbed of their saint. They were so angry they petitioned the Pope himself.
So now the Pope has to play King Solomon, but with a corpse?
Pretty much. Pope Clement VIII issued a decree in 1596 saying, return the body to Ubeda.
So Segovia had to give him back, the whole thing.
Well.
They negotiated.
Oh,
They reached a compromise. Segovia got to keep the head and the torso. Ubeda received one leg and one arm.
One arm? Where was the other one?
Someone had already chopped it off and taken it as a relic while the body was passing through Madrid on its way to Segovia.
This is literally dismemberment. It's gruesome.
It is. The man who preached about the perfect unity of the soul with God ended up physically scattered all across the map of Spain.
So if I go to Spain today, can I still see these parts?
You can. In Ubeda, there is a reliquary where you can see the leg and the hand, and in Segovia, his body, or what's left of it, is in a grand marble tomb.
It's a grotesque ending, but in a strange way, maybe it's fitting. He gave everything.
He held nothing back. Not his comfort, not his reputation, and in the end, not even his own physical integrity. He was poured out completely.
So let's try to land the plane here. Why does this 16th century Spanish friar still matter to a listener in 2026? I think it's because we are, as a culture, allergic to darkness.
Explain what you mean by that.
Look at our lives. We have lights on 2037. If we feel a moment of boredom, we reach for our phone and scroll. If we feel a moment of sadness, we try to medicate it or distract ourselves from it immediately. We treat pain and boredom and silence as errors to be fixed.
We're terrified of the void.
Exactly. St. John of the Cross comes along and tells us that the void isn't empty. He tells us that if you can just stop running away from the darkness, if you can sit in the silence, if you can bear the feeling of the training wheels falling off, you will find something much more real and durable than the noise.
So the darkness is the tunnel, not the dead end.
Right. He is the patron saint of hanging in there when things make no sense. He validates the difficult, confusing seasons of our lives. He says, you aren't crazy, you aren't failing, you're just traveling at night.
And the dawn is coming.
The dawn is coming.
That feels like a very good place to leave it. A little bit of hope from a very, very dark cell.
Absolutely.
This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.